Hello everyone! Today we are here to paint the When Dinosaurs Ruled the Earth art kit. I'm very excited about this one. This is one of my favorite scenes from the movie and I've been wanting to paint it for a while and I just didn't know quite how to do it. But then when we came out with the new art kits, I thought this was the perfect opportunity to do this iconic scene with the T-Rex and the banner falling down. So before we get going, I'll just tell you a little bit about my setup. Underneath the art kit here, I just have a piece of paper, and this is just so I don't get my table too dirty. So just a piece of newspaper or any sort of paper you have lying around just to protect that. I did open up all of my paints so they're ready to go. If you do pause and take a break at any point, just make sure to shut your paints. I've done this way too many times where I forget and the tops will dry out. So it's just a good practice to shut them if you do end up taking more than a 10-minute break. I have a little plastic lid. This is just from an old margarine container. I find these work best because after you're done and the paint dries, you can actually just peel the paint off and then you have a fresh palette every single time you start. I have just a little cup of water. This is an old jar. Any sort of cup or like old pickle or jam jar works great. Don't really want to use a cup from your kitchen just because you are going to get paint all around the rim here. So it's just a little difficult to get off. But if you have a dedicated jar, it's nice to have. And then I have just a piece of paper towel here. And this is just for drying off your brushes after we clean it up. You can also use an old rag, but anything just to dry off your brushes will be perfect. So I have everything just layered up here just to kind of have a look at what we're working with here. But we will actually start with the background. So I'm going to set the banner and I'm going to set our T-Rex aside for now. And with the background, I drew on all of these leaves just because I thought it'd be really fun to be able to go through and you can kind of have some fun with the background with the textures of the leaves. But to start, I'm actually just going to take my green straight from my paint pot and I'm just going to really give this a good coat of green. Now, I like to wet my brush when I'm doing large surfaces like this. This is just going to let the paint last a little bit longer and then just help the wood absorb the paint. And now you can do yours any color that you'd like. I'm doing mine all green and then I'm going to add just a little bit of detail to the leaves. But another nice idea, you could actually paint the background a different color and then just paint the leaves green, or you can really have fun and make it your own. So you don't feel free like you have to follow along with me with every little thing. You can really get creative with it. But I'm just gonna do, and then even though we're going over all these engraved lines, you'll be able to see once the paint dries, you can still see those lines really, really well, which makes this kit nice and easy to follow along with because you'll always be able to see those guidelines. And as you can see, I keep dipping my brush in the water as I go. And that's just to make it a little bit more fluid because this is a really thick acrylic paint, which is really nice for good coverage of the wood. But it does make it hard when you're doing large areas just because it is quite thick. And you don't have to go too crazy on your edges, just because that frame is going to sit over it, so we're not actually going to see any of that. But you can get nice and close to the edge, but you don't have to spend too much time getting right over or even painting the little hang tabs here. So. I do also like the effect when you're adding water. You can actually see a little bit of the wood grain through, which I think adds just a little bit of character to the background. I know it seems like we're using a lot of our green up, and we will actually use this entire little pot on the background, but you don't have to worry because this is the only layer where we're going to be using green. And if you do find your green is going a lot quicker than you originally expected, the other thing you could do is you could mix and just pull it out onto your palette. Some of the green and some of this nice mustardy yellow. It will actually just add a little bit of a yellowy tone to the green. But yeah, if you find you're getting close to the end, just grab a little dab of this and mix it in. And you'll be able to make that green go a little further. I'm just making sure everything has a nice coat, and just see if you need to touch up anywhere. And as you can see the paint drying, you still get all of that nice texture of those leaves coming through. So I'm gonna wash my flat brush here. And I'm just gonna dry it on my paper towel. And then we can actually go with our little detail brush. And I'm gonna go around, I'm gonna take a little bit of the brown and put it onto my palette. And I am adding some water just to make this a little bit more fluid. And then I'm going to go around and I'm just going to outline and follow right along the lines some of these leaves with the brown. And you can follow and do the full lines, or you could just do the sides and the bottom, whatever you're feeling. I kind of just did the bottoms and then the sides of this leaf. And then if you want, you can also go right down the middle and link into the little stem here, and just adding that little crease in the leaf. And then you can go along and just add little details. Actually, you know what? I'm going to skip this leaf and I'm going to kind of do every other leaf brown. And we'll go through and just add just little bits. And yet you don't need very much brown, just a tiny bit with a little bit of water to make it nice and flowy. And every other leaf, I'm just going to go and I'm just following along those engraved lines and adding just a little bit of detail. When you get to ones like this, you could actually just paint in the little holes if you'd like as well. this one here too, I'm just going to add that little bit of a line in the middle. And the goal of the background here is we want these leaves to kind of all have a little bit of detail, but we don't want them to be too detailed because you really want the dinosaur on top to be the main focus of the piece. But just adding a little bit of brown, and then we'll go in, we'll add a little bit of light as well. It's just going to give the background a nice, interesting look. And I'm really just bouncing around and just kind of picking any leaves that look like they could use just a little bit of detail. And I do always like adding this little middle line down to the stem. I'm going to save these big leafy ones, and I'm going to do, I think, the black on those just to keep it a little more interesting. Also keep in mind the dinosaur is going to cover quite a few of these leaves, so don't worry too much if you're not too happy. We can always, once we place the dinosaur on top, we can put a little more detail in the leaves that are going to be fully exposed, but it is nice just to get some practice with our paint and then just following along the lines on these ones here. That's actually looking pretty good. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to switch to just pulling a little bit of black, and I'm going to do the same thing as with the brown. Is I'm going to add some water. I'm going to make this nice and flowy. And then I'm going to go along some of these ones here and just follow along. And just nice little flick of the wrist on all these little leaves. And you can do a nice middle one as well. Did I miss any? A couple down here. And also, if you don't have to do them all, if you like a couple with just the engraved lines, you can really just add as much detail as you'd like here. this little one kind of coming in the side. Perfect. And I think I'm pretty happy with that. So I'm probably going to leave it like this for now. And then once we have our dinosaur, we can go and we can add in some little extra details once that layer's on top. So I'm going to set this one aside so it can dry. And we're going to bring our dinosaur in. Awesome. Okay, so here you can get creative with what color you're going to use for the frame and then also the dinosaur. I am going to start by base coating him just the pure brown from our little paint pots here. And then I'm going to do the frame just black. But you have all of these fun colors at your disposal, so you can really, have fun and do any colors that you see fit here. I am going to start by painting the dinosaur and then the frame last. And the only reason is because this is going to get covered with paint. And then as soon as we do this, our wrist is going to get covered with paint. So I always try to get the least amount of paint on me as possible, which usually doesn't happen, but we can try. Awesome. And if you do get any paint on you, this is washable as long as it's still wet. So if you get any on any of your clothing or any fabric, just use soap and water while it's still wet and rinse it out. If it does dry, it does become more permanent and it's a little harder to get out. So just keep that in mind if you do get any on you, but it is non-toxic and it is washable when it's wet. So I'm not going to worry too much about my lines here. I am just going to paint this whole T-Rex brown. And we'll come in and we'll do all these little details later. And then this is why we have a piece of paper in behind, is just when you're doing all of these, you're going to get a little bit of paint. And I'm not worrying too much about my lines here, just because when I paint the frame over, we will go carefully around these lines and just cover that up. And a little bit of water will help make it flowy as you make sure we got everything covered here. And he is looking pretty good. Perfect. So once you have your T-Rex all finished, we will just go around and paint the frame. So I just have some black here. And I'm going to paint mine black, but... Oh! Going in the wrong color. And then just make sure you've got a nice coat and there's no little spots missing. And you're going to want to make sure that these little tabs are nicely painted because this is our top layer. With the banner will go across, but and he is looking pretty good. So I'm just going to wash my brush. So then we'll just set our T-Rexes aside to dry. Oh, and if you're started drying against your paper, you can just pull off any little bits that that decided to start drying already. So we're going to pull in our big banners here. Now with the banners and all of this little lettering, we're actually going to start with red. So I'm going to do red letters on a black banner, which is what it was in the film, but feel free if you do want to do a different color scheme, you can paint the banner any way you'd like. So I'm just going to go in for my pure red. I'm just going to kind of work it into the brush on my palette. And that's just because I don't want it too globby, because what I'm going to do is I'm not going to worry too much about the lines. And I'm just going to make sure that I get red paint all inside the letter. And then what we'll do is we'll use our little detail brush and we'll come in when we paint the black of the banner and we'll do this all very carefully. But for now, I just really want each of the letters to be red. So I'm just gonna and black is going to cover this really nicely so you don't have to be too careful. Make sure you got just a nice coat. I'm just going to go over and do just a little bit of a second coat. I just want the red to be really rich in the letters. I don't really want to see any of that wood grain through, just so they really stand out. So just gonna make sure they got a nice perfect. I'm just gonna wash this brush here. And we are gonna wanna just give this a minute just to dry before we go ahead with the black. So I'm actually just gonna set this one aside, and we just don't want any of our paint to mix together with that. And I'm gonna pull just both these layers in to take a quick look at. So once you have them layered up, you can see, quite a few of our leaves end up getting covered behind. So then we can take our time and we can do the leaves that are actually going to be shown. So for them, I'm going to go and just I got a little bit of green left here, so I'm going to pull just a little bit of that onto my palette. Clean my brush between grabbing colors. And I'm going to grab just a little bit of white. And I just want to make a nice light green. And then this I also made quite watery, just so we get some nice flowy lines. And then what I'm going to do is, any of my leaves that are exposed, just going to go and I'm just going to add just a little bit of highlight. That's actually quite stark. I'm going to go and grab just a little bit more green. That's a little darker. I'm sorry, a little lighter than what I wanted. See that? It stands out quite a bit where that's more what I was looking for. So something just a little bit more subtle. And if you ended up doing anything like that, you can just go right over it with your new paint here. So I'm just going to follow along those engraved lines again. And I'm really just going to add it just on. So any of part of the lines where you didn't add the brown, you can add a little bit of the lighter color, or you can go and just add a little to the tops and the sides. So here I'm really just sticking to the sides and then the top of the engraved line on the leaf. And it's just to add a little bit of highlight. And then we can follow along that little middle line. And then you can just see how that one really pops now with that little bit of extra paint. And I'm just going to go any leaves that are exposed and just add a little highlight line to the tops of the leaves. And then that middle line, I just did it right beside that brown line. And it's really just gonna just show off the detail of these leaves. And then if your paint is nice and watery, it is actually going to dry a little bit more subtle than when you initially paint. So, which is nice because we do want that T-Rex. I'm not going to do any right around the T-Rex because I really want him to pop. So I'm going to just do the ones that are kind of off of him. or her. Actually, it would be a her from the movie. Oh, and then if you get any on your frame, you can just use your finger, or you can just use a little black paint to touch up. But I know it's dangerous doing it with both layers on, but nice to be able to see what you're working with. So yeah, anything not too close, I'm just going to add just that extra. And if it's a little too watery, you can always just dab it on your paper towel and that will just absorb some of the excess. This one I went a little too much water, so I'm just gonna dab it with my finger, and that will just tone it down a little bit. Perfect. And then yeah, we just have just a little bit of detail on these ones. It's looking pretty good. And then the last thing I'm gonna do, just to make this T-Rex stand out, while I have both layers here, make sure your layers are lined up on all sides. We're gonna take our flat brush here, we're gonna dip it in water, and we're gonna dip it in black. And now we want this black to be quite watery. We don't want this to be too thick. So you can't really tell there, but on my white piece of paper here, if you can see, as soon as it starts to dry, it goes very light gray. So just kind of practice on a piece of paper. And yeah, you want it to be just a really nice watery black, just so when it dries, and I can just show you for contrast, the actual just pure black paint is that dark. And we want it to be watery enough that it dries this light transparent black. So once you have that, I'm gonna hold down on my T-Rex, and I'm just gonna take this and I'm just gonna follow along. This might seem scary, but trust me, it's gonna look really good once we're done. So just use this nice transparent black, and we're just following them along. And then once you have your initial line there, just really use your dry brush and work it kind of back and forth. And we just want to add a shadow below the T-Rex onto our back. And it's really going to make him pop once we get all the detail on our T-Rex. And we're doing this before we paint him, just so if we get any black paint all over our T-Rex, it doesn't matter yet because we haven't done any detail. So I'm just following along, and then I'm using, once my brush kind of dries out here, I'm just kind of working it around him. And I'm going to make just a little bit more watery black. And I do always like to just pre-test it. It's not quite watery enough. And just do a little test that it's transparent enough that it dries within just a couple seconds on your paper and will just absorb right in. That's pretty perfect there. And just following along the edges. And as you can see, as the water evaporates and it dries, it's quite a bit more subtle than just like a hard black line. Awesome. So once we got the shadow all around him, I'm actually going to go ahead and I'm going to do the same thing with the frame. And just add just a little bit of a shadow for that frame. Just to really show off the different layers on this piece. And then once your brush is nice and dry, you can just work that watery paint. Just work it in. Awesome, that's looking pretty good. So yeah, we just got a nice shadow all around our dinosaur here. And then our nice little bits of detail on the leaves that are exposed. Perfect. Okay, so I'm now going to take my little background here and I'm going to set that one aside. And we will come back to our T-Rex because he should be fully dry by now and ready to go. So before we go in with any detail, we're just going to add a really nice texture all the way through the dinosaur. And this is going to be a little bit easier than trying to do just little bits of texture later. So we're going to start by pulling in some of our brown. And give your brush just a little bit of a wash in between. I'm going to grab a little bit of this yellow. And I'm going to grab just a touch of white. So if you can kind of see, I don't have too much paint here either. It's just a really small amount, and I'm going to mix these together. And I have just a nice golden brown. It's not a lot of paint, it's just enough. And we're going to kind of get this brush really nice and messed up, essentially. So I'm just dabbing my brush, and so my ends kind of are making a bit more of a bushy end. And then this, once we kind of dab our brush onto our dinosaur, we're just getting a nice texture all the way through. So I'm just using the side of my brush, or you can use the end of your brush, kind of depending on the area you're working on, but we're really just smushing the brush bristles. That's a fun tongue twister. The brush bristles onto the dinosaur and just kind of keep coming back in. And this is it's quite dry. You could add a little bit of water if you wanted to, but I kind of like this dry, and you can kind of do a mix of smushing and dry brushing. And the goal is just to really texture up this brown so it's not just flat. And we're just going to kind of go along and just really have fun with this. This is just so we're not working with just a solid color, but giving him just nice texture for all the scales. And I'm really just smushing and ruining my brush, essentially, with this one. And if you run out of paint, you can mix more. I'm gonna just start by adding a little bit more water and just seeing how much more I can get out of this. But it's nice just to kind of test it out. And I'm gonna make a bit more here. So I'm gonna go into my brown. Oh, my brown is getting a little bit empty, so we'll just make sure we got the brown on there. And instead of washing it off the brush, just so I don't lose all that paint, I'm just going to use my tiny little detail brush to pull in a little bit more of the yellow and more of this white. And this time I'm going to add just a touch more white. I want it to just be a little bit lighter. Once it's drying, it's a little lighter. And you can kind of just keep adding little bits of paint until you get a nice golden medium brown is what we're shooting for here. Let's see how that all mixes up. That's looking pretty good. And just really go around and just give him a good amount of coverage and texture. And a mix of bouncing the brush, rubbing the brush, and a nice dry brush is working out a little better here than too much water. And if you do end up getting a pretty messy brush at the end of this, one way to bring your brush bristles back is when you wash this, you can actually use some dish soap and you can reshape the brush with the soap and let it dry. And then that will actually revive some of your brushes. Just a little tip if you end up, I ruin a lot of brushes. I really like adding texture and using my brush like this, which you can ruin your brush pretty quick by doing this, but it's just too much fun not to add this nice texture in. So just kind of keep going until you're happy and until he's got just a nice even texture. Where that needs it. And he's looking pretty good. Yeah, so once you're done, we'll just give this a good wash. And then when it's almost dry like this is when you can grab some dish soap and you put the soap, you kind of glob it on with no water, just the soap, and you can actually reshape your bristles, and then you can let it dry, and then it will be back into its normal shape, or you can just kind of put them back down. But I always like using these ones for texture, so they end up getting some fun shapes after. Awesome, so that's looking really good. So we are going to grab just our little detail brush. I'm going to take just a little bit of black and I'm going to go and add black into just the full circle of his little eyeball. And then with the black, I'm going to just carefully go in and I'm going to leave the tongue here brown, but with the black, I am just going to go through and paint the roof of the mouth. So you can kind of just watch out for the teeth. And so it's just going to be all about patience and taking your time. And just painting in between the little teeth. And to get a nice fine point, I always like to have just a little bit of water on my brush, and then I just roll my brush, and you get just a really nice point to work with when you're working in small areas like this. And just follow the lines and we'll paint this whole inside black. And then once that's done, I'm just going to make a little bit more black here. So I got a black with just a little bit of water just to make it nice and flowy. And what we're going to do is we're going to follow along all of these engraved lines. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to the right side or the inside of the lines. So if the engraved line's here, we're just going on the inside of the lines, and we're going to go along and just follow on the inside or the underside, depending on where the line, if it's horizontal or vertical. So here the line was on top and I just followed underneath it. And if the line is on the left, we're going to follow to the right of it. And we're just going to do that with all of these engraved lines all over the body. And also the little ones around his eye, we're going to do the exact same thing. We will leave the teeth themselves, but I am going to, in between the teeth and the roof of his mouth, which would be kind of where his gums would be, we're just going to also follow along there with this black line. And with this, we're really just establishing where the shadow is going to be. Now, the only exception to the lines are actually going to be with his little legs here. So with the legs, we're actually going to want to add the black to the left side, and that's only because his body here would be on top of this leg. So we're going to add, and we're actually going to add a bit of a thicker black line here than just a small one following the engraved. We're actually going to add just a full little shadow. So we're going to follow along that line and then just kind of bring the black out a little bit further, just to really show that this is on top of this leg. And then with this leg here, we want to show that this leg would actually be on top of the body. So we are following along the left side of the line here, and just get more paint and more water as you need it. And this one we're also going to make a little bit bigger. And then on this side, we're going back to the old rules of on the right side. And it's really just to show that this leg here is on top of everything else. So I got my black, and I really just accentuated these lines here. And I'm going to take this black, and I'm actually just going to kind of follow along just on the underside of his tail. As well. Awesome. And then with all of these lines, we're going to want to do exactly the same thing as above, where I'm going just below the line, just below the engraved line with the black paint. And then this front toe is actually on top of this back toe. So we are going to put the black on top of this line here. And I'm actually just connecting the lines just to really accentuate those little scales on his toes. And then you can also add just a little line of black on the very bottom of the feet here. And then on the leg here, I'm going to follow along on the bottom side of all these little lines and then making black as you need it. And if I'm going too fast, the nice thing about this video, you can pause and rewind as much as you need to. So don't feel like you have to keep up if I'm going a little too fast. So just on the underside of all of these little lines. And then all these toes look like they're really in the foreground, so you can just follow along. Normal rules here. And then I'm just going to add a little black line to the very bottoms of the feet. And then on the tail as well, I'm just following along underneath the engraved line. And then to the right of the engraved line on those two there. And he is already looking really good. And just, you can touch up any little bits that you see if you need to. I am just going to add a little bit more of a shadow behind this little arm here. So we added a little black line, but I'm just going to accentuate it just a little bit more, just like we did with the legs, just to really show that this arm is there. Actually, I think this arm does end up getting covered by the banner, but that's okay. And I am going to add just a little line on the other side of the arm, just to show that this really is going to be a limb that's separate from the body. So if you ever want to really accentuate anything, adding black below the thing you want to accentuate, and then we're going to add white on top, is actually what makes this look realistic and is going to make it pop out from the piece. So shading and highlighting is one of the most important parts of painting. Awesome, it's looking really good. And then I'm just going to also, this little line here just under his mouth, I'm going to make this one just a little bit bigger as well, just so it really looks like it's his head's separate from the neck here. Awesome. That's looking really good. Perfect. So we're going to grab our flat brush again, and we're going to add a little bit of texture. So just like we did when we added kind of texture all the way through, but this time we're going to want it to be a little bit lighter. So if you can see here, I grabbed our nice medium yellow, and I'm going to grab just a little bit of the brown. Clean my brush off. And then I'm going to grab just a good little chunk of white, but I'm going to place it on my palette over here. And then this way I can just grab little bits of white at a time. And we're going to mix this all together. can just go in here and I can grab a little bit of white without contaminating my big pot. And I'm gonna keep going until I have this just a really nice light caramel color. And mix this all together. I think that looks pretty good. So yeah, very caramelly is what I'm going for. So once you do that, I'm gonna take my brush and I'm gonna just dab it on my paper towel so there's still paint. It's like if you try on your piece of paper here, you're still getting some of the paint, but we just don't want too much. And if it becomes a little too dry, we're just gonna dab in here just a little bit. And then we're gonna take our little bit of a texture, and just like we did before, we're just going to add a little bit of this texture. And what it's gonna look like is little scales. So kind of just dab it in your paint, test it on your sheet, and we really just want to add this little bit of texture in on any of the limbs that are not in shadow. So what we want to avoid is any of our really dark areas like in here. And we're just gonna do them on our, like this little leg here. And you can kind of just dab it. The dinosaur is fun because he's got so much texture. So just dab it. And we're going to get this leg and down onto his little toes. We can get the top and the middle of the tail, but we're going to want to just avoid where the tail and the leg attach. So we're just going to do this all along the top of the tail and a little bit into the middle. We can get the whole left side of the leg. And then we can get just a little bit on his little arm here. And don't worry if you do end up, just because the brush is quite big, getting some in the shadow. We can just repaint that over with black. But we just want to add just a little bit on that top of his arm. On this arm here. And then we really want to follow up and add some into this whole area. And then also onto his little jaw here. And just bounce around. And you can kind of take a little bit of a look back and just see if there's any little areas to add in this nice shadow. Perfect. I'm going to add just a little bit. I'm going to avoid the black lines, but I am going to add this in between on his neck. So just a little line of texture there. And I'm going to add just a little bit from his arm coming up onto his neck here. And then you can kind of just bounce around and make sure. And that's about everywhere. We want to avoid this area here and in here, but we really want to show that this part's going to be in the light, and then his two legs and the top of his tail. And using your brush kind of like a stipple and bouncing it like this is just a really fun way to get texture. I use the exact same technique when making grass or trees or fur. If I'm doing a sweater texture, this is just a really fun one to play around with. And if you end up doing a little too much, no worries at all. You can always grab your brown and go back in, and you can always make it a little bit more subtle if you're not happy with how it's how the texture's looking, or a little bit of black. But I think that's looking pretty good, just to really show off the texture there. Awesome. So I'm just going to wash this one, and I'm going to try to arrange my bristles again. We keep wrecking this brush. So, and then I'm going to take my little detail brush again, and this time I'm going to go into our pure white, and I'm going to put it onto the palette and just roll it on with just a little bit of water. Just give it a nice roll until you get just a nice fine point with the white. And then we're going to take our time and just make sure that any paint you put down here is dry before putting your hand on it. Acrylic dries really quite quick, so it shouldn't take much for it to be dry, but we're just going to go nice and carefully with our white. And we're going to paint all of these teeth. And to get that nice fine point on your little brush here, it's just a little bit of water and then just a nice roll to get a nice point. And just really take your time. And if you end up going over the lines, we can always go in with the black paint and touch up anywhere that ended up white that shouldn't have. So we're going to do the top teeth along there, and then we're also going to do the teeth coming around here. And his bottom teeth. Once you got all his little teeth done, we're just going to add a white line, the opposite of all the black lines we just did. But I'm going to start here, and I'm going to add just one little white line just to show off the tongue here. And then on the very top of his nostril, I'm just going to, and here I'm just following the engraved lines. So just along the top of his nostril. And then I'm also going to take it and I'm just going to really follow along these cut edges. And putting white along the cut edges like this is going to make him pop out from that background. So I'm going to add the white all the way down to his little arm. And keep mixing white with a little bit of water whenever you need it. I'm only going to go to his arm, but then I'm going to do all my white up here before I move on down there, just so I'm not getting my wrist into the paint. So any line where you added a black line below the engraved line, we're going to add a little white line on top. And you really are just going to follow along. And he's really going to take shape as we add all these white highlights in. Then I just continued that line from his jaw just to where it's cut there. But really anywhere you have a black line, you want to put the white just opposite of the engraved line and follow along. So with this little arm here, we're going to go along and we're going to follow it all the way around. Doing all this little detail is one of the most relaxing things I find with painting, is just going along your piece. And then so all of this little leg texture where we added the line below, we're going to want to do the same thing with the white on top. And then all his little toenails, we put that little black line along the bottom, so we want to add the white line along the top, and then just accentuate his little nails, or claws I guess I should call them, not little nails. And then also keeping with following along wherever there is a cut, you want to also follow along the edge. Just like that. can also follow along any of the cut lines. With this nice watery white. You can kind of take a little bit of a look back and see if anywhere needs to add just a little bit extra of the white. He's looking pretty good. So once you're happy and you have a little white watery line on the full outside of everything, and then also on the other side of all the black engraved lines, we're going to work on his little eyeball. But take your time. And you can always grab your background and see how things are looking, and we'll do that right after doing his little eyeball here and just see what else needs a little bit more attention. So we painted it just pure black, but in order to make it look realistic, what we're going to do is I'm going to grab some of our mustard yellow here, and I'm not adding any water, and I'm just rolling so I have my brush at a little bit of a finer point. And don't worry if this takes you a couple times to get. You can always paint the little eyeball over black and start again. But with this yellow, what I'm going to do is I'm going to follow along the ring of the eyeball, just along the inside. So we have the black still in the middle, and I just added a little line of the yellow for his pupil and his iris there. And now if you end up going a little bit too far over with your yellow, you can always just grab just a little bit of black on the very tip and just add that black dot back for right in the middle. So the goal is to have the ring of yellow with the black dot in the middle for the eye. And then once this is dry, so we'll just give it a sec there. It won't take long for it to dry. We're going to add what's called the spark of life. And it's what makes things look realistic. It's always my favorite thing to do on a piece, and it really makes everything come together. So I just took a little bit of white, and it's quite a little clump on the edge of my detail brush. And we want to add just a tiny little highlight on this eye. So we got our little bit of white, and I'm going to bring it over here, and we're just going to add this tiny little white dot onto the pupil and the iris there. And you can do your dot wherever you'd like. I always like to do mine to the right here. But when you step back, it just gives him that little bit of life in his eye. But take your time, and that little detail is just a nice one to really bring him to life. So I have a little bit of white still on my brush from doing the eye, and I'm going to grab just a touch of red. I'm going to mix these two together till I have just kind of like a light pink. There's not a lot of paint here. We don't need much. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to dab this little bit of pink onto the tongue. So we don't want it really heavy. I still kind of like that it's kind of brown, just because you'd imagine a dinosaur's tongue would be kind of brown. But with this light pink, I'm just dabbing just a touch of the pink color, just so it does stand out from the rest of his body, but I still like that it has that brown undertone. His tongue's looking pretty good there. And then we already have that nice highlight. There. And then clean my brush, and I'm going to grab watery white, a nice amount, just like the lines we were doing. And then I'm going to go with the very tip of my brush here, and I'm actually just going to add a couple little dots everywhere. So I'm just poking my piece, essentially. And if you can see here, I'm just adding a couple dots onto the tongue. And I'm going to continue on with this. And I'm going to add a couple dots just along anywhere where I have my texture. It seems like a funny thing, but it's showing the highlights of all the scales of the dinosaur. So just really gonna add these little bits of polka dots. Anywhere that's going to be in full light by our white lines here. You can just really have fun with this. And yeah, anywhere where you have this texture, this is just going to add just another layer to that texture. And we don't want to do this in any of the shadows. It's only where we've added this texture and then our little white highlights. And just bounce around. And then once the white dries, it is a little bit more subtle, just because we've added that extra water in. Makes it a little bit more transparent. That's good. And just anywhere that looks like it might need a little extra texture. Awesome. So next I'm gonna take some of our white. Oh, and I actually had some left on the palette there. And then some of this yellow here. And I want to make just a really nice light yellowy color. And I just want to add just a little bit of a different color. So his little claws stand out here. So I'm just going to paint these in. And don't worry about your little black line that we already added. right after this we'll go and we'll just re-add that in, but I do like when these stand out. Perfect. Once they have a good little coat, just gonna grab some watery black. I'm just gonna go along the bottom of them. A little bit up the side. And actually, you know what? I'm not gonna touch his top two. They're just so little that I'm gonna leave them just that nice, the nice light yellow we made. But then with just a little bit of pure white, and I'm not gonna water it down, I'm just gonna add just a little white line to just the very tops. A little bit more, and just to show off how sharp they are. Perfect, it's looking good. Oh, and anywhere you see you need a few little extra spots, I'm gonna add just a few more around his eye here. The white line is a little harsh, so by adding a bunch of little dots around it, it will just help blend it out a little here. So with this layer of dots, I'm going in just to my pure white, and I'm adding a few. So these ones, when it dries, it won't get lighter, but they're gonna stay that stark white. And this is just about another layer. All these tiny little layers are what's gonna make him look nice and her nice and realistic. I don't know why I want a male dinosaur. So after you get your first layer of dots dry, go in, and this is the pure white thick paint, and I'm just adding just another layer. I've got a little white still on my palette here, I gotta use up. Awesome. And then just like we did all those little dots with the lighter color, I'm going to go in with just a touch of black, and I'm going to add these into the shadows just in the areas where we're still just pure brown. So just in these kind of areas, just like we did with all those little white dots, I'm going to add just some little black ones. And taking your time with all of this little texture, it's really going to be worth it. So. And just anywhere where you kind of don't have any texture yet, and it's solid brown with the black lines, that's where we just want to go in and we want to add a few of these little black dots. And you can kind of blend your black dots a little bit in with your white dots as you get close, just to make it just a nice gradual from one to the other. Perfect. And then once your things are looking good, I'm going to set this one aside for now, but feel free to take as long as you want, adding in that little bit of texture. And to get them to look realistic, it really is just about layering the light and the dark. And I find those little dots are really quite nice because you have so much control over the dots, so you can put them where you'd like them. But I'm going to set this one aside for now. I am going to probably add a little bit more detail once I get him on the background. But I'm going to come back to our banner here. And first I'm going to start with our tiny brush again. And I'm going into pure black paint. I'm not going to add any water because I do want this to be nice and thick. And this is really going to be just taking your time. So I'm just going to shimmy my setup a little bit just so I can put this sideways. So for the lettering, we're going to take our black paint and we're just going to carefully follow along. And well, we might need a little water just to get it flowing here. We're going to follow along all of the outside of the letters. Just really take your time. And it really helps to move the banner into different positions. So I'm going to kind of do the bottom of all the letters, and then I'm going to flip the whole thing over to do the top, but really put it into a position where it's going to make this nice and easy to paint. Yeah, I find adding just a little bit of water. Not too watery, not like what we were doing down here, but just a touch of water will make it nice and flowy so you can really get some nice straight lines. And you don't have to go right to your edges. We can use our big brush. This is just to get all of this little detail. Oh. Dropping your brush is normal, don't worry. It's funny, the floor around where I paint is covered in little paint splatters, and it's all from just dropping my brush. I don't know how it happens, but you just lose grip sometimes. So then I'm just gonna flip this. Perfect. Okay, I'm gonna clean off my little brush. And now with my bigger brush, I'm just going to reposition myself here. Just going to go in and just paint anything I missed along the edges and get this whole thing black. And then this is a good time if you did go over anywhere, you can just grab your small brush and with the red paint, you can just do any little touch-ups if there was anywhere you went over. So it's looking pretty good. So we want to leave this one to completely dry before we glue this one or bring that one into the piece. But I'm now just going to grab my 2 layers here, get them lined up, and see what we're working with here. So now is a good time if there's any little details you do want to add. I think I'm gonna wait. I'm gonna glue mine all together, and then I'm gonna do my my final touch-up once everything is glued, just because then I feel like you're working on a more finished piece. So here we have our wood glue, and we have our popsicle stick for applying. So I'm just gonna flip the T-Rex over here, and you can just use your popsicle stick to spread around the glue. We don't need too much. This is a heavy-duty glue, so not gonna go too crazy, but I do want to make sure we do have all near our edges covered. And then just be careful on the little arm. I'm gonna put just a touch, but yeah, you really don't want globs of it anywhere near the edges or it will come out. It will come out the edges, so. Now I'm gonna follow along and just make sure there's a little bit on the frame all the way around. I am going to avoid the little hang tabs completely. So just because I don't want to interfere with the string going in there. Awesome. And I'm just going to set the glue aside. And just make sure you have everything lined up. So the little tabs are kind of the most important to have lined up. And then you can check your sides and then check your top to bottom. And then just apply a little bit of pressure. And don't worry if you have a little bit of glue coming out here. We'll grab our brush and we'll touch that up here in a second. Just make sure we're fully lined up. Just apply some pressure. If you have little clamps at home, you could clamp it or put a book on top just until it sets. But also just leaving it for 24 hours will be good as well. So with our brush here, make sure it's clean. So just make sure you give this just a really good wash and make sure you don't have a lot coming out. I'm gonna put just a touch of water so it's just a little bit damp. But what I'm gonna do is then I'm gonna run the brush just along the edges. And as you can see, it just takes away any of those little glue globs that are coming out here. There we go. And just really get your brush in there and rub it along, and it will just take care of anything like that. And just see if there's any other ones. I think I'm pretty good around my T-Rex. There's a little bit right here. And it's really just spreading out that glue just so it's not in a little clump. And then you won't even notice it. Awesome. And then I'm going to just make sure my banner's completely dry. And it is. If your banner's not quite dry, you're really going to want to make sure that this is dry before gluing it. I'm just going to play around with my positioning though before I decide where I'm going to glue this. So I want it to be below this hang tag. And then I want it to be above this foot. But then other than that, you can kind of play around if you want it a little bit more sideways. You can also go a little bit lower so you don't cover up any of his little arms, but you can really play around with where you want this one to sit. But I am thinking about here. So I want this little arm completely shown and this foot shown, and then I'd like this to be exposed. So I'm thinking right about there is pretty perfect. And that little arm gets covered, but that's just what's gonna happen. So I'm just gonna grab a pencil, and then I found a pencil here. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna just put a pencil line here and here, just on the bottom and the top. And I'm also gonna do it on the frame. And my reason is I want to be able to get glue below where the banner is going to be, both on the dinosaur and the frame. So once you kind of have your edges marked out, and just with a pencil is good, I'm going to just take this off. But then I can see exactly where to add glue, because the only glue that's going to hold this banner on is going to be on this frame and on this T-Rex. And then I'm going to grab my little bits of glue, and I'm just going to, I know it feels like such a shame after painting all this to cover up this area with glue, but it'll be worth it. So I got some glue there, and then I'm going to just add just a little bit there and here. And then make sure that I just have in the middle of where it's going to sit on the T-Rex. And then very carefully, I'm going to reline this up before I place it down. That looks pretty good there. And give this a good little push. I'm still going to add some final details onto the banner, but I do like getting this all glued together, and then you can really just add your finishing touches to a finished piece versus the layers. So, but you can do whatever you are comfortable with. So awesome. That's a nice amount of pressure there. First time seeing it all together. It's looking good. Awesome. So now that this is together, I am going to use my small brush, and I'm going to add a little bit of detail onto the banner with some white here. So one thing I want to do is add a little white detail line just along the edges of the banner here. So I have my white paint and I added a little bit of water just to make sure it's nice and flowy. And then I'm just following these engraved lines. And I'm gonna add a little trim onto the banner here. This is completely optional. If you are happy with your banner, or if you're a little bit scared about doing a thin white line like this, you can just do what you're comfortable with. And if you end up doing the white line and aren't happy with it, it's black paint, you can just touch it up. So don't get too scared if you do want to try this. You could paint over this entire thing all over again. Some of my paintings have 4 or 5 layers of paint. Just perfecting things until I was happy. And just making sure I got enough white and enough water. And one thing to watch is that when you put water on your brush, you might get a little bead on the brush. So you just want to make sure you grab that just so it doesn't fall down while you're using it. And I'm just so with our little string here, this is cotton macrame cord. You can do some really fun things with the hanging of this. I am just gonna do just a little knot, but if you look up online, there's some pretty fun ways you can tie this type of cord. And it, just because when you cut the edges, you get fun little tassels. So, but I'm just gonna feed mine through. Oh, I went from top down. Just gonna, there we go. Feed the cord through. And you're gonna wanna make sure you're tying it at a height you'd like. So whether you just want a little bit of string to hang, or you can go longer. I'm gonna do mine about there. I think looks pretty good. And then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take these 2 end pieces. I'm just gonna shimmy this down so you can see what I'm doing. The 2 end pieces, and I'm just wrapping them around my finger, and I'm just tying a standard, just a standard knot. Got the 2 pieces together. I'm just gonna tighten that up, and then double check before you cut your string that that is a nice hanging height, and I think that looks pretty good. And then with a pair of scissors, I like to cut off, so I have about an inch of cord left above the knot. And then if you pull apart the cord, this just makes a cute little tassel. And you could use a little comb if you want to brush this out, or just with your fingers you can kind of fluff it up and make a fun little tassel for hanging. And then I just use a little nail in the wall, or you could get some pretty cute decorative hooks. A tack would also work. These are not heavy, so anything in order to hang that up. And got our finished T-Rex. Well, thank you so much for following along and joining me with our new art kit here. I hope you had a good time. I would love to see your photos. If you guys want to go on and review the kits, I'd love to get some feedback on them. And I'm just so excited to see what you've created along with me. Thank you so much, and we will see you next time.